This is TWiT.
I want you to exploit me with some brown liquor.
So the other weekend, and I have to say, like, this bottle's almost done. That's how much I like this stuff.
Ooh.
A couple of weekends back, we did a weekend in the city, stayed at a friend's condo downtown, and we went to a very nice French restaurant, and they had some French whiskey. And I'm like, what? Rick, really? Whiskey? Like, you get cognac from France. Like, why would you get whiskey from France? And this led to a little digging around, and I'm like, oh, there's a whole line of them. And I tried a couple, and they were pretty good. And then I found that my local high-end rare whiskey store had exactly one. They had the Armorik, the sherry cask. And so it sat, I put it on my desk to stare at when I'm here, and then start reading and digging. And, of course, the more time I have to read and dig, the crazier the story gets. So let's talk crazy story here, because this is a whiskey made in France, specifically in Brittany, which does beg the question, why we use the word Britain in France? In fact, Brittany is the English word for that area. The French say Bretagne, or like almost Britannia. And the Bretons say Briche, because they're Celts. So the history of the Bretons.
Well, it makes sense they'd make whiskey then. That's cool.
Obviously, right?
They're known for their ciders, but
this distillery makes a ton of ciders. But yeah, this literally goes back to the fall. When the Roman Empire started to shrink and pulled out of Britain in the 5th century. And in came the Anglo-Saxons, right? Now, the Anglo-Saxons had already been invading before that, but when the Romans pulled back, it really went violent. And so a lot of people died, and many of them fled. I did sit down and read a Bede, which was an Anglo-Saxon monk who wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English peoples in 730 AD. So he was writing about combat that happened 200 years before by the Anglo-Saxons while being Anglo-Saxons. So his context was very much, well, the Anglo-Saxons were chosen by God, and so they were simply purging the inappropriate. So this was essentially 3 tribes of people from northwestern Europe. So the Angles come from Angel in northern Germany. The Saxons come from Lower Saxony, also in Germany, and the Jutes, which are from Jutland, which is now what we call Denmark. And they settled across England. The Angles, oddly enough, East Anglia. The Saxons in southern England, the Jutes you generally find in Kent and the Isle of Wight, although everything's mixed around. And literally that name is where the name England comes from. And if you think I'm trying to make a tidy summary on this, you're talking about 200 years of people moving back and forth. But a lot of those original inhabitants, the Welsh, the Cornish, the Celts, many of them fled England and ended up in northwestern France, in Brittany and Normandy, as in the Normans. The historical name of this area in Brittany along the coast is Armorica, and you will notice that this bottle says Armorik. So what do we know about Brittany? Well, it's like France. It is in France, so it's a great growing region. They're well known for their butter and their fleur de sel. Our andouille sausage originates in Brittany, although the Breton version of that has tripe in it. There's also the Normandy version of andouille is a little bit different, but really the andouille is from Louisiana. Yeah, and although from French people who have been moved around a fair bit, it is a good wine growing region, but it is a bit further north, so they stick strictly to the whites. And their famous wine is called Muscadet, which is not Muscat. Muscat is the sweet dessert wine. Muscadet is a dry white specific to this region, although typically further from the coast down in Nantes. And yes, lots of apples, lots of berries, huge cideries, and a handful of distilleries. And it happens to be that the one I could get my hands on is one of the oldest distilleries that was built in that part of the world. So Léon Warenghem set up the Warenghem distillery in 1900 in Lannion, which is in the far northwest part of Brittany, in an area called Côte de Granit Rosé, which is the pink granite coast. So the rocks along the shores in Brittany have a pinkish hue. And so that's why they're known as the Pink Granite Coast. His original product was not a whiskey. It was called Elixir d'Armorik. It is a liqueur.
Yeah.
Right. And by the way, 125 years later, you can still buy a 500 ml bottle for about $25. Same family still owns it, although there's several other families that have now gotten involved. I found a great ad from the 1930s from them that gave them a list of all of the products they were selling. They made 3 kinds of triple sec being distilled orange peel. And so they had a Mandarino Regence and a triple sec Salvatore and a triple sec Eclair. Don't know what the difference between them all. They also had a product called Grog Américain, which was probably a rum. Crème de cassis, blackcurrant liqueur, Mint Eclair, which is a mint schnapps, and the Rum Savannah, which is also, another kind of rum. And then the various schnapps. They did a mint schnapps, they did a cherry brandy, and Goulet Béton, which is cherry liqueur. So the cherry brandy is about 40% alcohol. The cherry liqueur is like 19%. So fast forward a couple of generations in the 1960s, Paul-Henri Warenghem, who is the grandson of the founder of Léon, partners with Yves Lézier, who the Lézier family is also a longtime family in Bretagne, and they start making meads, so what they call couchané, which is made from fermented honey. Again, like a strong beer, 14% alcohol or so. Although they do refer to them as the Milthic Celtic drinks, and a call back to their Celtic heritage. That being said, of course, apples are from Kazakhstan, but don't tell them that. They do commit to, so it's the Lézier side of the family that says, let's make French whiskey in the 1980s. When and it's right, the timing is very obvious. It's right about the time of the classic malts in Scotland, which created that resurgence in whiskey after the slow times of the 60s and the 70s, when United Distillers did that classic malts collection, which included Lagavulin and Cragganmore and a few others, that really kicked off a wave of whiskey. And that's right around the time that the Lézier started, like, could we make a whiskey in Breton? Their initial product a few years later was called WP Breton, and it was a blended whiskey. So they used 25% of malt whiskey, which was still young at that point, the first few years. They do whiskey without the yeast, so they're very much following the Scottish process. So it was at least 3 years old. But they were doing the French thing. So it was French barley, although it was 75% grain whiskey, which was made with French wheat. So fine. By 1988, they have their first single malt. It's only so good. And then at the same time, the son, Gilles Lézier, starts playing with apple brandy. So they're doing more distilling. He makes a version they call the traditional name for distilled cider, which is what you do when cider's getting old, is you make lambic. And if you make it in Britain, then you call it Lambic Breton. But he called it Fine Breton because it was better apple brandy. But the whiskey business gets really serious in 1993 when they actually build a set of French stills to the Scottish standard. So a proper pair of wash and high spirits stills, particularly for making whiskey. Now, the area that they're in is very Scottish. That is to say, it's along the coast. It is stormy there, lots of rain and so forth, good growing environment. It happens to be that the water source in Lannion is very low in lime, and of course, no iron and things that would normally be a problem for making distillates. And of course, they use French barley, although this distillery does not do their own maltings. They buy it malted, but they do their own grindings. The stills are not large, 6,000 liters for the wash still, 3,500 for the spirit still. Their new make, it comes at about 70%, although they do cut it to 63.5 because they do a lot of barreling in bourbon casks. This particular edition, the sherry cask, does exactly that. It spends, actually this particular edition only aged in sherry casks. We're not really sure how long, but it's probably only 3 years, and considering the color, that's fair. There's many other editions where they do bourbon for a few years and then finish in sherry, very traditional to the style. And they do some French oak as well, virgin French oak. So that's unusual. If you look at the color of this is an ambered whiskey. There's not too much. They're not doing any coloring. This is how the whiskey actually went. And the reason that bottle's almost empty is because, boy, it's good.
Now I'm jealous.
The thing I can't shake, and I'm trying to decide if it's my mind or it's actually the taste, is there's cognac in there somewhere. Like, it's got that cognac feel. It's got a fair bit of burn, but It's not fruity in that same way, the same citrus notes and so forth. Now, Cognac's in the southwest of France. It's quite a bit further south. It's just north of Bordeaux. Le Châtelain is the area, like the province in France. It's the next province down from Brittany, and that is where Cognac is made, obviously made from grapes, right? The Cognacs are a derivative of Armagnac, which was the traditional way that you preserved aging wine when it was in barrels and wasn't going to be good for much longer. You wanted to use the barrels for other things. You would, an Armagnac maker would literally come to your winery and would concentrate down the wine into Armagnacs, typically only in the 40-50% range. You'd let it sit till it was 40%. Cognac is much more sophisticated. It's a dual distillation process, and it's made to the purpose. But so I can't figure out if it's just my head or if it's really that there's something about the way they make whiskey there that, like all spirits, it's like, it's French. It's got a character to it that's very obvious. Now, these are fairly hard to come by in the U.S. I did find that Total Wine had one of the regular Armorik single malts available for about $75, which is pricey, but it's an unusual wine. This particular version, the Sherry Cask, I've only found in fancier stores for a bit more money, about $85. The one I'm going to have to find now, which I think I'll do while in Europe, is the Armorik Double Maturation, because they start in virgin French oak, local oak, and then finish it in Sherry Cask. So that should be the most French edition of this particular whiskey. But there's only a handful of distillers there, and they mostly make liqueurs. I mean, the bulk of the business of this company still is liqueurs, meads, apple brandy. The whiskey is kind of the third string there, but it's very good.
Aren't French oak casks used often in whiskey everywhere? Mm-mm. Isn't that, no?
No, they're normally used for wine and for cognac.
Okay,
and they're expensive, right? And the French are very sticky about not selling them too. Right. So it's hard to get away with selling with getting them. You just can't come by them very easily. The French, to the point where this distillery has actually gotten VOC, like the appellations, for protecting the methods, not just for the way they're making their whiskey, but also how they make their apple brandies.
Oh, interesting.
And so, but a lot of that domain mindset came from France in the first place. This idea of cognac can only be made in cognac and champagne can only be made in champagne. Right. Although those original, it all starts in France. It's not surprising that they jumped on this. Even though they're essentially copying the Scottish whiskey process, they are using French barley and they are using occasionally French barrels. And so this is our own thing. Like, we've made it our way. It's not surprising for the French. But it has, without a doubt, it has a character to it. They're not going to do long agings. It's there for further south in Scotland. So they're going to be warm, which means their losses in angel share are high. So you're not going to get a lot of 20-year-olds here, but and you'll notice none of these have a year appellation. There's a couple of special editions that are like 10s. So that's not how they're selling these things. What they're doing is making very nice whiskey with its own unique flavors and eminently drinkable. Not a stitch of peat. Just, no smoke in there. I swear to you, I would put this beside a cognac and you'd have a tough time. Now, that's true of any spay.
Interesting.
Right. And sherry finish in general. Like, I have often done tastings with people that were, annoying me with their pretentiousness. And so I'd stick a cognac in the middle of it and see if they could tell. And almost never, because it's mostly you're tasting the wood anyway. Right. So it's very hard to pick up. And this one would be doubly so. Like, I'd put this in a line of cognacs and see if you could figure out that it was a whiskey.
It looks like cognac, actually.
It does. It really has that color, and it drinks so much. Cognac.
Yeah. Interesting. I want to try it. That's great.
I know. I'm afraid I do this every week, where I really have found something interesting, and see, now you have the problem I have, which is that I have a lot of bottles of half-finished whiskey these days, and I've been home for several weeks now. So the stack is to the point where she who must be obeyed is looking at me like, "What am I going to do with all this? Like, we will drink them.
Well, I would have thought if you're home,
Obviously.
they would be thinning, not growing.
Well, you would think, except that getting a new bottle every week is, I'm going to only drink so fast. I would say this one's probably not going to make it out of the office. Like,
Yeah, I think you're right.
yeah,
Wow.
we're leaving for Copenhagen on Friday, but I think this one will be empty. But of the half a dozen bottles I've done while I've been home in a row, only 2 never made it out of the office. This one and
Okay, that's high
yeah.
praise.
but the others, like I still got some of the Gark in the decanter back there. The Writer's Tears went upstairs. The German went upstairs. And she's enjoying them, but they, this was a stunner
On a normal pace.
Yes. Yeah. The Laird of the Fintry did not make it out of here. Right. The Legend did.
So this is the Richard Campbell test. If it gets out of the office,
If you can, and one of the reasons this thing's in trouble is because I got it. I hinted at this last week because it was already staring at me, and I've had time to write about it. I ended up reading a freaking 1,200-year-old document about the history of the Bretons, for crying out loud. Like,
I love that though. I think that's great. That's what's interesting. There's history in all of this stuff.
There is.
Every region,
speaks to the terroir. There's just like part of the nature of the whiskey of a given area is the people who made it. And these are interesting people. They are in many ways original English before the Anglo-Saxons,
right.
And they hold. It's fun. I poked through the variations of the language, not just Breton, but Gallo, and like there's a half a dozen of them that are down to maybe 100,000 speakers left, and a lot of them are seriously influenced by French. But the number of times you see 3 or 4 names on something that are just the different variants of the local language there, but those Breton signs that have the French name underneath it. Dude, that's Gaelic, man. Like, truly,
Isn't that interesting?
the Celtic influence is there, and it's strong, and it's part of the style that they have there.
How cool! Yeah. How cool! My daughter studied in Rennes in high school. She spent a year in Rennes, so I know the region. I love it. It's a beautiful region.
It's a beautiful part of the world, without a doubt. But it's its own unique thing. Once again, there's complexity there, and it's all too often we just hang out in Paris when we're in France.
Right.
And if you're not, you're headed to the south of France, which, nothing wrong with either of those places.
No, absolutely not. Yeah.
Please go to Bordeaux and then go north. Go up to the coast and see something different again.
We love the whiskey, and we love your recommendations. You see, Linux Lizard picked up the 12-year-old Bowmore from last week and loved it.
Yeah.
So
not too much smoke, just a little, you're drinking something. Greg,
that's why I want to try the Armorik, because I'm not a peat fan. I'm not a smoke fan.
This is your, this is a French spey through and through.
That's what I want.
No 2 ways about it.
That's what I want.